to be here. And it's been another one of those interesting Hope on the Hill days for me. I'm going to go to two ends of the spectrum. On the one hand, I did go to one of the meetings with one of the groups with one of the congressional offices, and I want to talk about that for a minute. And then I want to talk about the larger context that all of this is taking place in, and try to pull together what the whole imperative is that underlies the Voice for Hope initiative, which embraces all of the things that we've been talking about, all the people in the room, and all the initiatives that all of you are working on. So I got a call from Steve. Steve was just here, now he's out, at about 10 minutes to 1 and said, I want you to come to this 1 o'clock meeting. And it was over at Congressman Conyers' office. And so I got over there about 2 minutes after 1, and they'd started the meeting. And Congressman Conyers is one of the icons of the House of Representatives. He's been around, since the mid-'60s or earlier, and he's a very powerful and a very courageous and a very significant player. And he's from Detroit, and it just so happened that we had some people from Detroit that signed up and got involved in the process. Judy helped bring that group in, and they had arranged to set up through us with Congressman Conyers. And all the Democratic Congress people are in a retreat today, so the actual members weren't there. But we met one of his senior staff members and had once again one of those experiences that we continuously have. He went on about what a great thing it was that his constituent was there, and that she was explaining things going on in Detroit that were important to him, and how this whole idea of natural health was important, and how important they had been at the Conyers office in creating the Affordable Care Act, and how to put pressure on to create natural health as part of the Affordable Care Act, and so on. It was quite an interesting experience. Let's see, you were there. Can you just take about 1 minute or 2 minutes and just tell your experience?
Well, I thought it was very powerful and very encouraging. In closing, I asked if we could consider at our government level 3 things. One is that we start thinking ahead, and thinking ahead means look at including integrative health alternatives into the Universal Health Plan. And then the third thing I asked that we would consider doing is trauma centers in conjunction with learning and wellness centers. Because if you put a person in a wellness center and you treat them, they can eat for a meal, but if you teach them, they can eat for life. So if they're just going to the emergency room for emergency treatment, but there's never a process of reformation or where education or where they're learning how to change and take care of themselves, they're going to end up back into the emergency room. And so those were the 3 things. They're totally receptive.
Not only was he receptive, he said, wellness centers, that is a fantastic idea. Let's think about how we can get wellness centers out in every neighborhood. How can we do that? And he started telling us how the House of Representatives works, how you draft a piece of legislation to get wellness centers, how you work that to get the money to support the wellness centers. Now, wellness centers didn't just suddenly spring up around the country after that conversation. But the point was, there was a real openness, and it was on a one-to-one basis, and it was from somebody from the district, and he talked about his own health situation, which they always do. He talked about going to a wellness center in Florida and seeing a model, and he described the model. He said they had a chiropractor here and an MD here, and then they had a meditation room, and they had a place for relaxation from stress. He described this, and he said, and I saw it, so I know it can work, and we could create that all across the country. This wasn't our side talking; it was their side talking. So what I want to say is my theory about all of this Voice for Hope activity, and we talk about it in the book Voice of the People, which was written by myself and a co-author. People think he's a conservative, people think I'm a liberal. Neither of us believes there's any such thing as a conservative or a liberal. We think in certain instances some people act in a conservative way and some people act in a liberal way, and then 5 minutes later they switch. I mean, it's just, and the whole thing is constantly in flux. And there's this dynamic energetic underway. And the basic point of the Voice for Hope model is to get right down at the individual personal level with the representatives and the constituents and have a conversation. The idea is, one of our points is that all politics is not only local, as Tip O'Neill, the great leader of this place, used to say, but it's also personal. All politics is personal. So if you can connect on a personal basis, you will begin a new political process. We believe that that's real, that that is actually what happens. And that the big problem that has occurred in our country, and I think it's worldwide, is that what goes on at the personal level, which is highly political, local, laid in the neighborhoods and the families and so forth, has gotten separated from the systems that are designed to express what's going on at the local level and the personal level. They're separated. And what's underway is a great reuniting of the energetic power that comes from individual interconnections and having it flow into the larger institutional framework that expresses it. And what we're working on is how do you reinvigorate that institutional framework. So I was over here on this grassroots basic level. Now I'm going to switch over to the big framework piece. Now, the way I conceptualize what happens is there's a bedrock reality that's going on all the time. And there are things people do. And it's really good for the well-being of all of us that the things people do be congruent with the bedrock reality. If you try to act and don't recognize the law of gravity, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And there are a lot of other laws that are out there that are affecting us that we don't recognize very much. And we act in ways that create trouble. The one that's most dramatic in the debate politically today is global warming. I mean, you can do certain things and pretend that they aren't affecting things, but when you start adding up the data and seeing what's happening, you say, whoa, something's causing something to happen. So what I'm saying is there's this stuff that goes on at the bedrock, and there's this stuff that people do up here, and there should be congruence between those. Well, in between, there's this level where all kinds of things have been thought up to explain what's going on. There's politics, religion, economics, and so forth, and they're all like ways of looking at what's going on active-wise. How do we act? Well, let's look at our religious principles. Let's look at our economic principles. Let's look at our political principles. Let's look at... Now, the problem is that almost all of our actions are referenced back to this wide variety of ways of thinking about reality, not back to reality. So that we're constantly saying, how do we make our behavior mirror our religious principles? How do we make our behavior mirror our economic principles? How do we have our activities mirror our politics? What we really need to start doing, and I think it's happening, what we really need to start doing is saying, how do we act in a way that actually connects with what's real? How do we reach through to the underlying reality, the bedrock? And personally, my experience personally at this level and looking at the larger picture, it's going on all over the world. Every single one of the intermediating institutions is under enormous pressure. My great joy the other day was when the Twinkie went bankrupt. We started out fighting food policy. I got into, let me give a little story to give you a feel for how this works, because what I want to get across that I believe that there is a driving force going on, and we're learning how to have our behavior be congruent with that force rather than laid across that force. In the mid-'80s or so, I observed and it occurred to me that the fundamental thing that was going on with humanity is that humanity was rediscovering or redefining itself as a part of nature rather than separate from nature. The 19th century created the idea that humanity can control nature. It can dominate nature, it can shape nature, and I'll never forget, I was in a sociology class and the guy gave us a true and false question at final exam. 20 true and false questions. First question, man has learned to control his environment. True or false? I put false, and I was wrong. I couldn't believe it. And I went to argue with him. I said, what are you talking about? I said, well, they have houses, they have heat, they have roofs, they have no, they don't get wet. And I'm saying, hey, there's just all this other stuff going on. Humanity believed for, all of the 19th century, well into the 20th century, that humanity could dominate nature. Just wrong. Just plain wrong. Humanity must be congruent with nature. That started to express itself going through the 50s and 60s and 70s and more and more and more. So we have institutions built around we can dominate nature, and we have people saying, wait a minute, it's not working. How do we make a politics that integrates those? So I'm sitting around in 1965, 66, and Nader writes Unsafe at Any Speed, and I have a class in law school in which I'm studying Ralph Nader, of all things. We had 15 people in a class set up by a torts teacher, an accidents teacher, and he's saying, each of you 15 will play an individual in this seminar, and I got assigned Ralph Nader, and we had to read everything by and about our character. So I did, and I figured, and I looked, and I saw that Nader was saying, in Unsafe at Any Speed, that large economic institutions are controlling the decision-making in our society, and that's not a good thing. That was the argument. That much. Because they're not democratically accountable, they don't come up with good decisions, they don't represent what we really want. So that was the argument. Page 1. The next 40 pages of the argument were, let's take the example of the auto industry. And he laid out the auto industry as an example. My point to Nader, which I tracked down and saw, was nobody's getting your argument. They think you're talking about cars, because he was a auto safety advocate and so forth. They thought he was talking about cars, but cars were an example. And he said, what could you do about that? I said, well, let's pick any other market. Any other market. And if you're right, the same thing will be happening there. We went back and forth, what markets? So finally I was interested in food, so I said food. He said, food, that's a great idea. I was a cook in the Army for 6 months. I like that line. And we looked at the food industry, it was the same as the auto industry. Cars, the manufacturer said, in cars, safety doesn't sell. Food guy said, nutrition doesn't sell. Cars were made for fashion. Food was made for convenience. Their fundamental reasons for existence, transportation and nutrition, gone from the whole marketing concept. That's true across the board on every single one of the organized economic institutions that we have. They do not, their job is to make money, as they say, for their stockholders, which is actually not true. Stockholders get about 15% of the after-tax profit. 60% goes to management. 60% of the after-tax profit goes to management. The other 25% goes to taxes. So stockholders get a teeny, weeny little bit of the pie, of that pie. But on the basis of that argument, huge economic decisions are made. And I'm saying, all through the time I worked with Nader and when we started the law firm and pushed all these battles, we ended up in food, and then we ended up in drugs because the drug stuff was as bad as the food stuff. And then we got into creating alternatives for those. Alternatives in food. I wanted to do biodynamic farming, but we didn't have the infrastructure for that, so we backed off to organic. We wanted to do something like, we tried to find what's the alternative in the drug area. It was homeopathic medicine, but again, it didn't have the infrastructure, so we backed off to acupuncture and used that as a form. And the idea was to say, look, here are forms that exist that can actually carry the need to integrate the individual lives with the larger natural forces. They were there. And that's true across the board in the economy. You can find it in economics, you can find it in insurance, it's everywhere. the issue that began to develop, and we saw, was what Nader had said in his report. You've got these huge economic institutions standing in the way. And so I can remember we had started working on computers because the supermarkets were putting in the UPC, the Universal Product Code. And that was, they were going to rip off the consumers because that's what they think about. We'll use this machine and we'll rip off consumers. And we started a national movement and changed that somewhat. And what they were going to do is take the prices off the food products so you could alter the prices on a daily basis without anybody knowing. And so then they could sit down and put the, and so the whole big thing was done, and they have to put the prices on, and we got laws passed and all that kind of stuff. But it got me into the computer world, in the telecommunications world. And that was in the late 70s that we were doing that. So we were right there when the computer stuff started going. And the whole telecommunications revolution. So I get asked by AT&T to come and give lectures on the consumer movement to their senior management. And I did it for 2 years. We did Tuesday morning at their management seminar, and I would talk, it was outside forces, and I was talking about the consumers. And I'm telling them that, you know, the consumer force is a powerful force and it's changing everything. And so the lobbyists in DC wanted to know why AT&T was inviting me to come and talk to their senior management, which went all the way up to the board, in fact. And we'd get 30 people in a room like this, and we'd start having a discussion, and I could get that audience to split into the pro-business and pro-consumer side every single time, just a group of 30 people. And I talked to the lobbyist from AT&T, and I say, he says, why do they want you? And I said, well, because the consumer movement is very powerful. It's in 1984. The consumer movement is very powerful. It's got lots of following. We have 10,000 consumer groups in New York State alone. This is having a major impact. Nader's got a 75